Years ago, when I was just starting out and trying to write things in the late 1980s, around the same time I wrote two things that have just very recently come back to haunt me in a very powerful way, because they are very much about today. One was a play called Peasants' Revolt. I've still got the poster for it here. It wasn't a great play, but it was one of my first, and I was just very pleased that it got produced and toured by a little company called Northern Lights, who were very good. And one of the other things I wrote was a poem called John Ball, and it won a poetry competition and got published in a magazine. And both of these things emerged from an interest I'd had at the time in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So, 650 years ago. Now, this revolt, as probably some of you know, was led by revolutionary Wat Tyler, and more than 60,000 people are reported to have been involved in it. That's, considering the population at the time, that's a hell of a lot of people. And not all were peasants. There were also soldiers and tradesmen. There were some disillusioned churchmen, and there were some itinerant preachers. One was called John Ball, who was known as the Mad Priest of Kent. Now, one of the main triggers for the Peasants' Revolt was the effects of the plague, a pandemic. So this is where it gets interesting. The plague had wiped out over 1/3 of the population of Europe, and this meant that there were fewer labourers to work for the rich. So the labourers moved from being powerless, underpaid peasants to being able to gain higher wages and better conditions. And surprise, surprise, the government of the day, the political class, mostly land-owning bishops and lords, didn't like this. And they also had yet another expensive war to pay for. So they passed a law to bring wages back down to pre-plague poverty levels and to keep them there. And they also introduced a poll tax. Everyone over the age of 15 had to pay a shilling, the equivalent of several weeks' wages. And if they didn't have the money, they had to give over seeds and forks, the tools of their trade, so they could no longer work. Now, finally, enough was enough, and people revolted against their masters. The Peasants' Revolt began in Essex and Kent. There were widespread outbreaks throughout southeast England. There were assaults on tax collectors, lawyers, landlords and their manor houses. There were destructions of documents that criminalised ordinary people. So this was very much a targeted assault on the political class. And finally, when the peasants march on London, King Richard himself comes out and promises to listen to the people's demands and act on them. But surprise, surprise, he then betrays them. And the mayor of London has Wat Tyler slaughtered. There are so many parallels to today. A pandemic changes the world. The political class tries to legislate against the people to control them, lower their wages, control their working lives, indeed their whole lives, their ability to better themselves and their children, their freedom of movement. And we have in the Peasants' Revolt political betrayal, increased powers to control, legislation to keep people poor, harsh punishments for transgressors, and a propaganda war by saying that the powerful have a God-given right to rule. So, ring any bells? Certainly should. For these people who revolted, what the plague set in motion was an opportunity to once and for all fight for basic freedoms and not to kowtow to a political class that always puts its own interests first and still does. Nothing has changed. If you're in any doubt of that, look at what's just happened. While most people in the country have less and some will have nothing, no jobs, no money, MPs are being given an extra £10,000 in expenses to help them work from home during the coronavirus epidemic. On top of the £26,000 expenses they already get and the salary of £80,000 plus. This is an insult to every decent citizen in the UK. And how many MPs will refuse to claim it? 0? Well, we'll see. And just like in the Peasants' Revolt, the ruling elite is using the pandemic to simply further their own agendas. So we have Things like MP Zara Sultana tweeting that, and I quote, "Black and Asian people are being disproportionately hit by coronavirus, reflecting wider economic and social inequalities. The fight against racial injustice must be at the heart of our response to this virus." Now this is such tosh, such moronic nonsense, it isn't even worth taking apart. But of course, much of the mainstream media loves it because it is in accord with their own agendas. Now, the Peasants' Revolt was against the equivalent of the civil service, among others, against faceless authority. It was against the increased powers of magistrates over the people. It was against social, political, and economic control of people. It was against propaganda. People were told that the world had masters and servants, and that those in authority knew best, including the church of the day, so they should just shut up and do what they are told. Sound familiar? So history doesn't just repeat itself, it's almost caught in a time warp. Those people, the 60,000 brave souls who said is enough, are not just our ancestors, they are us. They were the beginning of an English fight for universal freedom for men and women, for social justice, for freedom of expression, for the right to dissent. The Peasants' Revolt marked the beginning of the end of feudalism, and we owe it to them and to ourselves not to allow, in the shadow of this current plague, this pandemic, a new autocratic, totalitarian techno-feudalism to turn us back into poor, bewildered, frightened, impoverished serfs. One of the Peasants' Revolt great spearheads, the mad priest, John Ball, wasn't mad at all, of course. Unless by mad you mean angry. His words are for now. He preached those words to thousands in the open air at Blackheath, which was a meeting point for those revolting. And he said, and I quote, "Things would not go well with England until everything was held in common." He said, "Are we not all descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? So what can they show us? What reasons give that why they should be more the masters than ourselves?" It's in Ball's words that we find the early concept of the equality of all men and women. He says, "Why are those whom we call lords masters over us? How have they deserved it? By what right do they keep us enslaved? And how can they say that they are better than us? At the beginning, we were all created equal. If God willed that there should be serfs, he would have said so at the beginning of the world. We're formed in Christ's likeness, and they treat us like animals. They are dressed in velvet and furs while we wear only cloth. They've got wine and spices and good bread, while we have rye bread and water. They have fine houses and manners, and we have to brave the wind and rain as we toil in the fields. It is by the sweat of our brows that they maintain their high state. We are called serfs, and we are beaten if we do not perform our task." And he said, "Now is the time to recover our liberty." When the rebels had dispersed, Ball was taken prisoner and taken to Coventry, and he was given a show trial. Then he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at St Albans in the presence of King Richard II on 15th of July 1381. His head was displayed, stuck on a pike at London Bridge, and the quarters of his body were displayed at 4 different towns. This was a warning to everyone else. Don't you ever disobey us again. It's people like him we should celebrate, and not the tin pot leaders and cronies who try to preach to us from the pulpit of that glass screen day and night. I'll read my John Ball poem, so if you don't want to listen, now is the time to turn off. John Ball. I don't want to wake you, but lately your dream has pinched me alive. Your long bow, leather pouch, and fine muscle are still there on the page. Standing alone, I still hear the cuckoo call to arms. Leaf mulch and harebells still paint autumn. Stars print their shadows on branch and barn. There is still space for trouble, John Ball, but no arrowheads, billhook, pike, and pitchfork. They melted them down into supermarket stores, squadrons of tins, plastic cups, and dried food. Street lamps and the hot cough of diesel belch through the green, clean smell of rebellion. John Ball, I don't want to disturb you, but the slings and quivers are empty. It's not like that now. War is geometric, not confronted eye to eye, belly to belly. Stars grow slow as rockets go. Life and death conferenced by machines, eased by condoms and surgical creams. John Ball, make your own mind up. Choose your own ground, but the villagers are rusty. Their limbs cramp in cars, soften in beds. Their brains creak like summer thistles. Flicker to bingo, booze and ticker-tape dreams. Your enemy will slough in the softnesses. It's not your fault, but I'd like you to give it some thought. Underground you might worm some ideas from the earth. Your small band might ghost their way west, spike political tongues, shadow ministers, trip them in their cups, stake their minds bare. John Ball, I'm pushing you. I didn't begin like this, anodyne, brow-lined and worn, wishing the world your story, picked clean of messy detail, arboreous and full-fleshed. It's up to you. The forest is full of wishes, but needs someone who knows it. It may be too late. Pinstripe and pinball, graffiti the mind, stiffen the soul. All we have here are a few theories. It's your decision. There's a little space left between the bullets of noise and fear. Shout loud enough, John Ball, and someone might hear.